Hello and welcome to the last Hangout of the semester now, Crisis Management Integration 2. And this last week, or last Hangout, was in reference to the congressional report on the Deepwater Horizon spill and some of the leadership, decision-making, and regulatory issues that you discussed as a team. So I want to start with question one, which I think Ryan took that. And you discussed the key concerns that were, I think the first part that you addressed was not necessarily the spill itself and response to the spill, but everything that led to the blowout at the Macondo well. So some key issues that you commented on was a lack of proper risk analysis and failure of regulatory oversight. And I think you had a really good discussion here on that mineral management service, which was part of the Department of the Interior, which since has been resolved. And the problematic issue with that particular agency was that it was the licensing agency that was collecting fees for licenses, and at the same time they had the regulatory and enforcement oversight, or rather than enforcement, audit oversight. So in itself, there was a paradox because, as you noted, there were conflicting interests by the regulatory agency, which was also a beneficiary of those licensing fees. And something that I wanted to comment on with respect to minerals management services is that after the several really big incidents in Europe in the late 80s on the seas that had to do with spills and offshore mostly transport of oil. Europeans use, in Scandinavian countries and Great Britain after their Piper Alpha tragedy, they used what's called a precautionary principle. And precautionary principle stipulates that for any operator on those waters that deals with oil transport or drilling, you have to provide risk assessments. So that goes back to what Ryan was talking about. You have to document that you have risk assessments based on vulnerabilities, based on consequences, and you leverage all your response mechanisms, including logistics and safety planning, emergency operation plans, based on those risk assessments, and then you submit it to the regulatory agencies. So there is no licensing, basically, of those operators until so basically the audit happens on the front end. So you have to document to the government that you are a responsible operator and that you have all those procedures in place. So the onus of the proof is with the operator. So in the States, we have approached it almost in reverse, to where the licensing happens first, the risks are being assumed, and then of course, there are audits to make sure that those safety precautions are in place. Now, the problem with that, as you noted, was that over time, that regulatory agency did not have enough research and enough expertise to actually be a good enforcer, because those technical issues were way beyond their scope of expertise. So basically, you had bureaucrats in charge of dealing with very complex safety issues, very complex systems. So the experts certainly lie more on the side of the operators that do that every day, but not the regulatory agency. And again, the profit making from the licensing is also, problematic. And so that was, a huge lesson learned in that particular observed, as I like to call it, because precautionary principle versus risk-taking, two different philosophies. Do you request everything up front and you have experts, independent experts that are hired by the operators that have to document that actually meets all the standards, and then they are the responsible party if something happens because they are providing those testimonies? Or if you sort of, do everything up front and then basically the agency wasn't able to provide expertise and they did not have enough funding. And even if the audits were conducted, they really had no teeth because there was no enforcement mechanism. By the way, Ryan, congratulations on the dog. So as far as Nick talked a little bit about the willingness of the officials to address those safety concerns up front, because I think as you look at that event, and you had some discussion later on the Kuhn framework, you have to sort of truncate it to the planning and preparedness issues by all different stakeholders, Halliburton, BP, Transocean. And then you have the actual explosion and the response to that, which, Matthew had made some insightful comments about that. And then you have the complex evolution of that scenario into a very complex cascading series of events, which was trying to contain the spill itself and managing the world's opinion, public opinion, and advocacy groups and things like that, which was the PR nightmare. So Nick was talking about really nice references to the report, Nick, on poor maintenance practices, and also that something that we've discussed, or Ruben wrote about in first 100 years of emergency management, the American experience, 100 years of emergency management. I think my screen froze for a second. So Ruben identified those three enemies of good practices for emergency management, right? Complacency, denial, and hubris. And I think that, what Nick referred to was the belief that something like it's just basically a lack of imagination, which goes, as Ryan mentioned, with proper risk assessments and estimations of risk, particularly in fields that are doing quite innovative things. And with offshore drilling, this was the unprecedented feat to drill at those depths. But that was not matched with proper projections or simulations or, some kind of modeling of worst case scenarios and then mitigating to prevent things like that from happening. So there was some discussion on British Petroleum being for profit, and you had a back and forth, and I think Nick was trying to also mention that BP did spend and wrote checks and was trying to get ahead of the event once it happened. But if you look at the record of BP spent millions of dollars on positive, environmental friendly campaign. If you look at their logos, they actually changed the name from British Petroleum to BP to sort of get away from that petroleum word, and their logo is green and white and very environmentally friendly. And they are very, very strong lobbyists, yet in the 90s and in 2000s, they had a record of one of the worst polluters and one of the worst safety records in the world. So naturally, you gotta ask, and I think you ask those questions, is the image of BP, have they recovered? And I think it's a very interesting question. I think Nick had it. I'm going a little bit out of order, but Nick asked at the end, I wonder about the resiliency of the organization to be able to take that branding blow and to be almost, accused of, the assassination of the ecosystem. And there is something to say on the front end of PR, because as bad as this event was, and as glaring as some of the safety processes were, BP, I think, is pretty resilient, and it's an investment, in their PR and lobbying. So, that's a totally different type of resilience than what we've talked about. And it was very interesting that Nick brought it out. And so it begs the question, does money buy organizational survival at the expense of actually spending the money on safety? Or did they do their cost-benefit analysis and they realized that it's going to be a lot more efficient for them to not invest in those safety improvements, but more in their public image? Again, it's a very interesting question that has to do with organizational resiliency of big corporations like that. Of course, there was some, as far as decision making, who's in charge. That's one of the critical pieces of any incident management. Who is in charge? And we have talked for a couple semesters now about unified command and standardization, and everybody is on the same sheet of music and common operating picture. And there were issues in that event that Nick brought up, the Stafford Act. And I was really glad that it came out in your discussion, because that's what we have been practicing for the last 15 years. We have been practicing the National Response Framework, which is the national approach based on Homeland Security Presidential Directive 5. It's the national approach to managing domestic incidents. Well, clearly, the Deepwater Horizon is a domestic incident. It happened off the coastline of the United States. Now, all the Gulf region states, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, they have had a very active part within the National Response Framework. The governors of those states coordinating, and with FEMA and all other Department of Homeland Security. And Louisiana had their experiences with Katrina. So in Katrina, the National Response Plan that was, quite inadequate. In Katrina, we had, if you recall from the last semester, Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. And this act really bashed, the inability of states and local jurisdictions to be self-reliant, and stress the reliance on the local level and that tiered response that starts at the local and then goes to regional and state and federal, and not waiting for federal assistance. So imagine everybody who is in emergency management, disaster management, and particularly the state levels in those affected states, is thinking in that framework, and it's thinking Stafford Act, right? Because this is, those are the events. However, the irony is that for critical incidents that have to do with oil spills, there is a totally different plan. There is a totally different framework that was, hammered out in the late 70s. And that's after the Exxon Valdez spill that many of you mentioned in your presentation. Exxon Valdez happened in late 70s, 80, maybe 89. I don't recall. But after Exxon Valdez spill, the National Contingency Plan created structures and mechanisms for managing those type of events on coastal waters. Now, there is a difference between National Response Framework and National Contingency Plan, particularly as far as incident command, safety officer, on-scene coordinators, all those different mechanisms that had to do with connectivity of federal government to local jurisdictions. So now we have an issue where all the professionals in emergency management are thinking, we're going to follow the National Response Framework, and the Coast Guard, EPA, BP follow the guidelines of National Contingency Plan, and there is no crossover, there is no crosswalk. And so that, of course, in addition to confusion, it created mistrust, it created huge communication gaps between those local jurisdictions, and ultimately mistrust and conflicting interests. For example, I don't know if you remember from the congressional report that the role of safety officer, is really clear in National Response Framework. So this is a position that is really critical, but it's not mentioned in the National Contingency Plan. So the safety of first responders, there was no funded function under National Contingency Plan for that aspect. So when you look at all those volunteers who were de facto first responders, there were no protective personal equipment and measurement of, hazard factors for untrained responders. Some of them, not even speaking English. The Vietnamese boat operators that were being put in hazardous health hazard conditions. So again, the reason is that there were two different frameworks at play. And they were not compatible in all instances. So this goes to who is in charge, and also what kind of playbook are you using. If we have a National Response Framework and it's supposed to be all hazard, but then you have so that's a different hazard. And I think that's something that we've discussed as well in our intelligence and information discussions, because it goes to that as well. It goes to the management of information flows. Bureaucracy of federal government, political challenges. You mentioned that EPA not having experts that were good enough to actually have a say in this event. The federal government or EPA abdicated most of the decision making to BP because of expertise. And because BP was very proactive, and because they were under that premise that this is private and public partnerships, right? So there's quite a lot of controversy about that, about the eagerness of the federal government to be so proactive to work with a private partner, sort of overshadowing the fact that the private partner is all about the dollar signs. So of course, there are political challenges there as well. Between Ryan and Nick, you talked again about the issue about energy independence and proper efforts to ensure environmental protection. And if you collocate both in one agency, which in this case, I'm going back to the mineral management services, that is a very conflicting role for one agency, because there are those two roles would be sort of hard to negotiate, on one hand, energy independence, so the race for exploration, and on the other is, making sure that you preserve and protect the ecology. And the environmental security as you know, is very debatable today. So depending on what side of the argument line you are, certainly that really obscures the issue if it's within one agency. I think Matthew was talking about some of the things that Matthew mentioned was the issues with the first critical incident, which was the explosion and the consecutive deaths of the workers, and also the way they were their short-term recovery or response to their needs, and the fact that there was very little on the psychological aspects, or the psychological concerns were not being taken into account in that short-term recovery, so to speak, recovery for the crew. And there were some testimonies that the investigations by the FBI were taking place before the crew members would get off the ship and join with their families and be debriefed in a different way. So I think that that's something that was very insightful for you to glean out of this, because at the end, the tragedy that is measurable certainly is the explosion and the resulting loss of life, and that was the first tragedy which we could measure, because we have people that perished, and the psychological impact on the people that were involved is huge, and will probably remain huge. And I think, Matthew, you mentioned you saw the movie, and I have planned to, since it came out, I've been meaning to go and see it, and still haven't gotten to it. So Nick was going back to the Exxon Valdez spill and saying that it takes a catastrophic event to almost like a catastrophe creates opportunity. There is a theory on that every catastrophe, especially the huge one, we call those focusing events in our previous semester. The ones that are the last straw, the last straw, and they trigger change. But you can look at it two different ways. Certainly, Exxon Valdez brought a lot of attention to the drilling and oil industry, offshore oil industry, but there are certain things that happened in Exxon Valdez that were not remedied at all. For example, recent research has indicated that there were no baseline studies on the health of first responders in Exxon Valdez. So research on the impacts on the health of responders, and many of them died, could not be scholarly determined. So no empirical or comparative studies could have been performed on the impact of the spill itself on the health of rescue workers, emergency responders, because there were no safeguards to conduct some baseline measures. Well, that wasn't done in Deepwater Horizon either. So as you watch all the people in the Gulf who were volunteer responders complaining of respiratory issues or effective Corexit and stuff, there is it's going to be an unmet need, because we cannot positively determine what kind of previous existing conditions those people had when they came into this incident. There's a very similar case as in Exxon Valdez. And after Exxon Valdez, one of the findings was that research is very sorely needed. The research on impact on ecology, the research on the use of particular technologies or agents. And we come to 2010, and the research is not there, because you have in a way, in regulations, you have this policy window to where you have to have let's say you have this great catastrophe, it typically causes a lot of media coverage, and the media coverage and highlighting of all the errors causes public outcry. So when you have a tremendous public outcry and you have a catastrophic event, then you have political will to change things, because the voters will put pressure on political leaders to implement change in policy. If concurrently there is research that comes out that confirms that changes have to be done, so if those three lines meet, then usually you would have a good window for policy making. So at X and Valdez, those three lines did not totally converge, because even though there was a lot of pressure and political will and public outcry, the research did not catch up. So there was no research that would sort of push forward that dramatic changes in policy. Now, after Deepwater Horizon, 5 years after, in 2015, there was a slew of emerging research talking about toxicity of Corexit, and the fact that what they did with that oil, breaking it with Corexit, was 50 times more toxic than if they let it be and float, and so on and so forth. So you had quite a lot of impetus in 2015 to actually change policy, and that didn't happen. So some changes have been implemented after Exxon Valdez, but we're still repeating the same mistakes, so to speak, many years after that. And so we certainly want more research done on ecological impacts. And at some point, I think, Matthew, you brought up the issue, or maybe Nick, that the ecosystems have strong internal resiliency because they absorb the shock and are able to come out and thrive. And this is yet to be seen, right? The immediate impacts are certainly, certain deaths of animals, dolphins, fish, pollution of shrimp industry, and stuff like that. And then, the scientists decided, yes, the algae ate broke down the oil and the chemicals and volatile chemicals, and plankton ate it, and the environment self-cleansed and revitalized and healed itself. But that's only one part of the research. The ecosystems are connected in many numerous ways, and there are different variables and factors. And what happens with research is there tends to be a focus on one thing after an event like that, and then the funding is gone after a while. So I don't know if the impetus is there right now to change policy, based on the things that I've talked about, precautionary principles and things like that. But it will be interesting to follow and watch, what happens with national contingency plan, and whether there is some alignment that's being built into that with respect to national response framework. So, do some research on that, because that'll be interesting to see 7 years down the road after this spill. Matthew was talking about the agencies, government took back seat, the different partners were pointing fingers at each other. So between the Halliburton and Macondo and BP, there was lack of prioritization during the initial explosion. What to do, I think they were in the chaos phase, and they could have cordoned off the area much faster. There are standard operating procedures that what you discussed, Matthew, that were not observed. They did not have the right equipment. Now, of course, they were totally in denial on the resources that they had available because of the issue of emergency operation plans being, poorly adapted templates from the regions and places that had, totally different characteristics. Alaska is definitely different than Gulf of Mexico. So I think Nick was talking about the fact that, even if they had some equipment staged, they were offshore and some of that stuff might have not been immediately available to them. Matthew made some points about when you moved from, response to the recovery. And on recovery, you talked about long-term recovery of the ecosystem and the resilience of the ecosystem. We have the systems rejuvenated after Exxon Valdez and after some other events like in the Baltic. And recovery priorities, the restoration of economic base for affected communities. This was particularly true because of very similar populations that dealt with losses in Katrina. They were still recovering from Katrina when the Deepwater Horizon hit. So you could ponder the issue of, the recovery process being so difficult to manage, especially the long-term one, because somewhere in that recovery process for a jurisdiction, there is going to be another event, and there's going to be the response to it, and there's going to be a short-term recovery. So you might have emergency management that has to sort of forego recover on one because they are tending to the response and short-term recovery of another. And clearly that creates, cascading and complex issues. With Louisiana particularly, those fisheries are the livelihood of those communities and the tourist industry. So you mentioned some, public information campaigns. I think Nick had a really big discussion on that, how they were doing a lot of public service announcements about the beaches being clean and the tourism being invited back, and trying to revitalize and bring those businesses back together. But certainly financial loss to community, especially a community that is not corporate, that is small family-owned businesses, those boat operators, very small business, that research documents that most of the small businesses cannot survive, without generating income. They don't have a capital to last more than a month post-disaster without constant flow of capital. So BP, of course, was very involved in paying out, but there were some issues with how those checks were written and to whom. And finally, the governor of Louisiana had to implement some regulations about, how those funds were going to be distributed. You went back to talking about the templates, and you brought it back to our discussion on continuity of operation planning this semester, and some reflections on when rubrics and templates are very useful for some standard operating frameworks, and where you actually need the agency itself to engage in a process of determining what are their priorities. And I think that was part of one of your discussion boards, and Nick commented on it, that somebody external did the COOP and the stakeholders were not included. So it was a boilerplate that was sort of, one size fits all, but it wasn't taking into account, there was no dialogue with the people that actually knew the organization and the characteristics of the organization. So a very delicate balance in planning between, what you can save yourself effort doing, because you are not going to reinvent the wheel with some of those planning processes or checklists or SOPs. But then you also have to do prioritizations based on where you are. And that goes back to what Ryan talked about, which it all starts with proper risk assessments and proper mission assessment and the proper vulnerability and proper strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats, or they call it SWOT analysis, where each jurisdiction or each agency should have those and not rely on something that's, cookie cutter. And then, of course, you can have templates for public information releases, for things that, if you need to reassure the public and you've got something boilerplate, that's definitely useful in critical incident where time is short in that response moment, to where it's useful to have things that are pre-made, pre-published, and so on. So as far as leadership, you've discussed all those C challenges. So collaboration, communication, coordination. I call those, the triangle C of emergency management: coordination, collaboration, communication. This is pretty much the heart and soul of any practice in emergency management. So Transocean had a near miss, and I'm not sure who commented on that. It might have been Matthew. You discussed the fact that they had an event that they did not advertise, and they were not transparent about it, and they swept it under the carpet. And so, that could have been a good opportunity to sit down and discuss those issues, those safety issues. And that was just 4 months prior to Deepwater Horizon. So no lessons shared. We have problems with lessons learned. They seem more like lessons observed. But if we don't share them, that's just sort of going nowhere. Ryan had a big discussion on cement with Halliburton and BP and the cement tests that failed, and again there is a lack of communication. And Matthew mentioned there wasn't even an issue of collaboration; it was just the wrong collaboration or poor practices of collaboration, and that's something that I mentioned between the Coast Guard, EPA, and BP to sort of there was that relegation of federal authority to the private, and the private is always going to be a wolf in sheep's skin as far as public is concerned, because it is all about profit for them. It was hard to get accountability, particularly during explosion. I think Matthew discussed that, the loss of power, confusion, and something that stuck with him. And so that was, in the immediate aftermath. And multiple corporations that have their own agendas. And, if one company cuts corners, that is a domino effect and affects the other company, and all they care was putting the oil in the barrels. And of course the multiple unseen incident commanders by Coast Guard, that was directly linked to the National Contingency Plan issues. Making decisions without assessing risk, you had a really good discussion about that. No unity of command, that's again that alignment with national response framework, 3 different unseen commanders, no continuity of operations, different objectives because of that. And so then you moved on to the Cuneiform framework, and I really liked Nick putting quite a nice visual out there for you and putting some work through to process through it. And you had a very interesting discussion on that, because I think as you were talking about it, you were trying to figure it out or sort through it. So I think that you agreed that it was not an obvious situation, not the situation that created the opportunity for standard operating procedures, even though you did say that the decision making in the pre-explosion was obvious. There was, you can sort of take it to no incident phase. But however, it is pre-incident phase. So there, if you follow A, you should come to B. So if you do that safety precaution, if you train people to be able to do this, if you have redundancy of people that can actually turn the valve or are authorized to do so, those are obvious things. And that is a kind of decision making that is very typical of, planning and preparedness. And it is in mitigation that you ask more of those complicated things. What if? And you look for experts, right? In recovery and mitigation, you might want to look at, architects and land designers and meteorologists and, subject matter experts or SMEs, because you're going to be more in the realm of complicated. But for a lot of things, operationally, it's obvious. It's pattern matching. A certain course of action matches the certain outcome. And then the discussion was not necessarily before, but after the blowout and in the initial efforts to, on the platform, and then later in trying to contain the spill. And I think that you had quite a lot of questions about, are we in a realm of complicated or are we in a realm of complex? And Nick was trying to go for complex and saying that they did not know what questions to ask. There were unknowns, and about which people could not possibly even identify who had expertise. So this puts you more in the realm of complex. Versus complicated is you can ask the questions, you might not have answers, but if you get the right people to get you answers to those questions, you can get them in time, but you're realizing what the components of the situation are. You are able to, you don't know what's the best course of action. It's not standard operating procedure, but you sort of know who you're working with and who you can ask, and you can do the simulations or some type of modeling. And that would be complicated. Complex is where you realize that this is going to be experimentation and taking different courses of actions, a lot of mental simulation, and trying to go for that. And in that process, you might figure out, what kind of expertise you're gonna need. I would place the Deepwater Horizon efforts to stop the oil gushing as complex. Not complicated, but more complex. Complicated might have been the initial response to the explosion. I think they were complex, but I really don't think that's truly an issue, which one it is. It's whether the team that's managing it knows in which they are. And of course, you talked about, how you can move from thinking you are an obvious and you are not an obvious, and you're going to drop off into chaos. Because obvious, it's the most, creates the most complacency in a way. It's, you're pretty certain you're going to have an answer, and you do pattern matching. When you start being in complicated, you are not as certain. And when you're in complex, you just, you definitely know that you don't know things. And so knowing where you are is very important. So what type of decisions you're going to do, and how you gonna delegate authority, and how you're gonna collaborate, and who you're gonna ask for help. Being a good incident commander in those situations is knowing which situation you are in. And I think part of the problem with Deepwater Horizon was that initially the commanders and people that were responding to that, they thought they were in a complicated, but they were in complex. So they were trying to use processes used for complicated, where in reality they should have been situating themselves in a complex situation, if that makes sense. I encourage you to think about that framework. It's a really good framework that underscores the value of situational awareness. And you don't have situational awareness if you don't do all those things that we've been talking about, preparedness and planning and safety process and communication processes, and experience, of course, as well, because your mental simulation is only as good as your practical experience. And you have discussed that all semester, that you cannot be a good incident commander if you do not have a requisite amount of experience. If you are trying to get ahead of a certain situation, you've got to have that domain knowledge that comes from the field. Nick, you were trying to evaluate whether cause and effect could be determined in an event, and I would sort of go with you that probably the entire containment was a complex event that was trying to be managed as if we were in a complicated sphere. So lesson to self for decision makers like that is, with events like Deepwater Horizon, those are called black swan events. Those are going to be cascading, complex, with many different variables and consequences that we can't possibly perhaps predict for the next 5 years. As far as what the oil's gonna do when it sinks to the bottom or sits at a certain level at the depths of the ocean, we're not able to answer those questions because research was not there. So we are definitely not in a complicated, because in complicated you just get a brilliant mind that it's going to give you the answer, but in a complex where answers are not there yet. So I think that's sort of where I would go with thinking about the future in emergency management and handling those black swan events, to where there's so many moving parts that no matter what you do, you're going to be certain about the outcome. Because they were dealing with a complex situation in a complicated manner, it created a lot of ad hoc decisions and reactive decisions. And for example, the decision to use Corexit because they were, afraid of a public opinion and managing of public fears, as people were watching satellite images of a big black thing covering the ocean. Matthew, I think, talked what I was talking about, knowing where you are. They were in complex, they were trying to deal with it in a complicated way. I think Matthew made a very similar point when he talked about somebody thinking that they're in obvious when they're actually in complicated. So that sort of drills it back to ability to see the context, ability to see to have that situational awareness of the highest degree. And you go back to the incident command tales from the hot seat, and think about situational awareness of those commanders. I don't know if you recall the one that took the ship to the Falklands during the Falkland War, the British Royal Navy commander, talking about how incessantly he walked those decks night and day in shifts and talked to people and knew, who had family issues and problems, and, in order to know exactly what kind of capital he was dealing with if something was to happen. That's your situational awareness is only going to be as good as all the work that you do on the front end for it. At the end, 7 years after Deepwater Horizon, and we are seeing the high levels of resiliency in the Gulf communities. At least that's our hope. The tourism is back, the fisheries are back, we're eating shrimps from Louisiana. And so, with that positive note, Matthew talked about the rejuvenation and the fact that it sort of eventually self-contained itself. We did not get, it didn't get to Texas. Obviously, there were fears here about that. There, showed a few tar balls, brought on ships. The ships that came from that region, we didn't have a currents that brought all that stuff here. You closed with bouncing back, and Nick had a little bit of a okay, let's give credit to BP at the end when the credit is due, because they put a lot of millions of dollars back into the community. And so that's true. They did. They're still tied up in courts. Did they really lose that much on branding? I think that's the question to ask yourself. I think that they're not considered as eco-friendly anymore as their campaign was leading us to believe, but they certainly post-event were trying to mitigate as best as they could and help the communities, to the point where I think there's quite a lot of discussion on using those responders, those volunteer boat operators. It was the Boats of Opportunity program that they created, to where people who had those boats could get money for helping with a response. There's a lot of debate about that. They could have used experts from California, which that deal with disaster cleanup and disaster recovery, that are experts on that know safety precautions, that there's quite a lot of pressure that they support the communities. Now those communities got exposed, and now there are health issues. So those are very, very complex issues to resolve, but definitely BP was writing the checks, and at some point, handed over a big chunk of a budget to the federal government to allocate. So they actually transferred a lot of money to the Fed to distribute for mitigation and recovery practices. So I wanted to thank you all for this semester and for all your engagement. I enjoyed your presentations. I probably won't have another class with you, so I wanted to wish you all the best with whatever remainder of a program you've got, whether it's capstones or a few classes to pick up along the way, or if you are walking. I wish you all the best. Good luck, Ryan, with a new dog. I think, Nick, you might have had a baby. I'm not certain by my calculations from last semester. And Matthew, good luck on your move to California. You will be safe, and keep in touch, and I wish you all the best. And keep on thinking about the disaster management and the cycle of crisis management. Have a great summer.